Welcome to In the Name of the Law, with your host, Lisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm. Joining her today is Stephen Sinas from Sinas Dramis Law Firm, Amy Bailey from Bailey and Terranova Attorneys at Law, and Mary Chartier from Chartier Nyamfukudza PLC. Now, let's discuss some remarkable stories and real cases.
Hello, and welcome to In the Name of the Law, a legal talk show about real people with real legal problems. Today's episode, we're going to talk about invading separate property in a divorce action, snitches in the criminal justice system, and how to select a personal injury attorney. Stay tuned.
In the name of criminal defense.
Good morning. We're here today talking about witnesses who testify for the government in criminal cases. And I have here with me Chartier Nyamfukudza, Mary Chartier, and Lizzie Carey. So first of all, what do we call these witnesses? Are they snitches? Are they jailhouse informants? What's the term of art that we should be using?
Well, we actually disagree, so on what to call them.
I like snitches, but the more polite phraseology is incentivized witnesses.
Well, it's interesting because the reason I don't like snitches or jailhouse informants is it indicates that they actually have information, right? So if I see Lizzie steal a candy bar, I may snitch on her and say, which I wouldn't, Lizzie, but right, that is assuming I have information and I'm sharing it. The big problem are these paid witnesses or compensated witnesses who don't have information, but yet they're claiming that they do. And that's why I don't like calling them snitches. But we disagree all the time on what to call them.
What do you call them, Mary?
I like calling them their paid or compensated witnesses.
So what do they get in return for their testimony on behalf of the government?
Well, I think for someone who's doing time away from their family, the only thing that really matters, which is time off their sentence. Right? Because $1 million won't do me any good in, the 4 seasons. That's what I call most county jails.
Right.
But yeah, you really can't spend that money. So time with your family, especially for people who have young children, right? Difference between seeing your child or grandchild when they're 4 versus 14, right? So, yeah.
So why not try throwing someone under the bus when you can get home to them quicker?
Right. And some people actually do get paid in money. In a lot of terrorism cases, if you go back, a lot of the individuals who claim that, oh, well, I know that Joe or Larry is involved in terrorism are getting paid a significant amount of money. That's not unusual. And that's why when there is a case of a snitch or a paid witness, you want to try and get the file. And a lot of times you have to fight with the government for it. But that should detail all the times that they've provided information about someone, what they received in compensation. Sometimes it's been a Whopper at Burger King, but that's supposed to be listed, and then whether the information was any good.
So is it always disclosed what they're getting, or one, that they're paid
No.
or incentivized in any way, and then how they're being incentivized?
No, and that's why you got laughs from everybody on this panel. No, and that's one of the big issues, fighting to get that information and then making sure that the information is accurate. A lot of times the government will get around having to disclose it because they may say to a lawyer, well, listen, if your client does X, Y, or Z, then this will be the result. And so the witness on the stand will say, well, listen, I don't know what I'm going to get. I'm just trying to be a good citizen. It's always a fight for the accuracy of that information.
Is there a difference between the incentivized witnesses in the state system versus the federal system? Are you more likely to get the information you need in one versus the other?
There's a bit of a difference in that you see in a lot of federal drug cases, people jumping on a case. So they'll know that Larry Smith is going to trial, and then all of a sudden they'll be in jail and they'll be like, oh, I bought drugs from him too, right? We're both from the same town. We're both from Grand Rapids or Detroit or wherever it may be. And you'll see that a lot when there's no corroboration. The witness has never called the defendant on the phone, never got a text message, nor have they ever gotten a call from the client. There's nothing but the witness's word that they ever interacted and purchased drugs.
So can you give us a couple of examples of how it works to have an incentivized witness?
Well, one of the cases that we're working on right now is a case from 1994. And Lizzie and Takura and I have spent a lot of time on our feet in Detroit chasing down witnesses. This is a gentleman who claimed that our client confessed to him in jail that he committed this murder. And that is the only evidence that he was convicted on. There was nothing else, no forensics, no DNA that linked him, nothing. So in 1994, he's convicted of murder based on the testimony of this very highly paid, I would say, in time, compensated witness.
And not on just that case either, so many others. And what's amazing about this individual is that within hours of their arrival, different people just came to this guy. I don't think he was dressed as a priest or anything.
crimes.
Exactly right.
Right. He says he was walking by the cell, and then the client decided that he was going to say, hey, guess what, right, I committed this murder, with very specific information, the date, the time, the person's full name. But what's interesting, and this was never disclosed, is, in the lawyer, so the gentleman's trial lawyer didn't have this, but he had testified against a boatload of people.
Because he was staying in the holding cell. He was sentenced to prison, I believe, but didn't go to prison. He was just living in the holding cell.
Right, on Beaubien. So instead of going to MDOC, they never sent him over to MDOC. He stayed in the holding cell and kept saying, oh, well, this person confessed, this person confessed. He had how many aliases?
Oh, over 20 at least, and that's not an exaggeration.
What, did the government put him on the stand?
The government put him on the stand, and the client was convicted, and he has been fighting since 1994 to try and get released. And I think we're very close to getting him released. But one of the interesting things about that is the gentleman who, I can't even call him a gentleman, the witness who testified said that the client had confessed to him on a particular date. But the client hadn't even been arrested by that time. He was arrested a few days later for joyriding because he was just this young teenager.
So does the law not require some sort of corroboration when you have this snitch on the stand?
No. And that's one of the saddest things is you'll have people just come in and make claims, and they'll, if a jury believes them, then that leads to the conviction. Other states are more active in trying to get either some level of corroboration or mandating really strict disclosure on promises, because even though prosecutors are supposed to disclose that, many don't. But Michigan is doing absolutely nothing in that regard.
And then what do you know about this person who's coming to testify? What do you know in advance? Do you know their name, what they're convicted of?
Well, a lot of times that's on us.
Right.
We do investigation, sometimes social media. Lizzie and I, we spent an entire day in the basement in Detroit, digging up records, looking at hundreds of pages of information. So really, it just comes down on also paying attention to the details, right? Dates, times, and so on. And so the government isn't going to give it to you.
We've got to do that.
So you have to do your own research digging into this person. Then I would think you'd have to educate the jury about the reliability of this witness's testimony.
Right. We recently had a federal case where the government didn't disclose any of the individual's background, but we were able to find out he testified in 3 different murder trials claiming people had confessed to him. He had also, snitched, for that's the word you like, on well over 30 people. I mean, nobody gets that information.
Well, thanks a lot for sharing, and keep up the good work and investigating these cases.
Thanks, Lisa. If you're interested in learning more about this topic or other criminal defense topics, check out our podcast, Constitutional Defenders. We're on cndefenders.com or on any platform site where podcasts are hosted. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
In the Name of Criminal Defense is brought to you by Chartier Nyamfukudza, PLC. In the name of personal injury law.
Today we're going to talk about the realities of selecting a personal injury attorney. And I have with me our regular guest, Steve Sinas, and also what a thrill for me to introduce George Sinas. They're both of the Sinas Dramis law firm, very well-known personal injury law firm here in Lansing.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, so we're here to talk about this really important issue about the reality of selecting a personal injury attorney. And most people don't think they will ever be injured, but if they're injured, the question becomes, what should they be looking at and what should they be considering? So I'm really happy to have my father and partner, George, here. He's been a personal injury attorney for decades, to talk about all the unique aspects and the importance of deciding the right type of personal injury attorney to hire if you were ever injured.
Well, Steve, isn't it really just simple? Back in the day, we just look in the phone book. Today, we might Google or like whatever's on the 1-800 ad on TV. Don't we just call the number on the TV screen, and that's how we pick our attorney?
Unfortunately, if you do it that way, you may be very much disappointed in the decision you make, or you might not get the right attorney for you and your family. So George is here, and I'd like to kind of turn it over to him to talk about aspects of this issue and give all his wisdom to us today.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but Lisa, in answer to your question, yeah, you could do it that way. It depends on what your needs are and what your expectations are. But in the 38 plus years that I have been representing seriously injured people, I will tell you that when you get out of the hospital, the world looks totally different. You're dealing with significant medical issues. You're dealing with work disability and the concern about whether there's going to be any income flowing into your home. And you're dealing with the ever increasing complexity of insurance companies. And I have come to believe that it's really important when you're about to make that transition from hospital back to the real world, you team up with a lawyer that can really help you through that process. Because there's a lot to do. There's not only the investigation that's required in these cases to determine how the accident happened, but there is an incredible amount of work that has to be done with the insurance companies, and this is particularly true if it's an auto accident injury, because Michigan has an auto no-fault law that just got much, much more complicated this last June when the legislature passed these amendments. And now it's not clear exactly what you need to do to make sure that your bills get paid, your wages get continued, and your legal rights are protected. So if you're dealing with auto injury, particularly in this era, you need first to find a lawyer that focuses his or her practice in that area of the law, because it really is a specialized area of expertise. And you need to have a lawyer or a relationship with a lawyer that will work with you in all of these various areas, not just say, I'll take your liability case and you're sort of on your own dealing with your insurance company. I think you really want to try to avoid that kind of a relationship, because you're going to find that it's not everything that you need and that needs to be addressed. And then the last thing I think that's important is don't select your lawyer based solely on a TV advertisement or a radio ad. Check them out. Talk to people that are knowledgeable about that area of the law. Talk to former judges. Talk to other attorneys. Talk to victims who have gone through the system. Really check it out. If you needed heart surgery, you wouldn't pick a heart surgeon based on a radio ad or a TV ad. You'd really want to know as much as you possibly could know about that particular physician. How do they work? What's their approach to my particular medical situation? And it's the same thing with law.
So would you suggest that the more serious the injury that has occurred, the more carefully the person should take their time in selecting the right attorney?
I think that's very true, because the more serious the injury is, the more treatment that's going to be needed, and that means there's going to be more interfacing with the insurance companies because you're going to be in the system longer. And this is especially a concern that I have with regard to some of these new changes in the law, which can really make things much more confusing than they need to be.
And I'll just add, we've talked about this issue before on other segments on the show, but in America, there's not anybody who's assigned to be your advocate if you've been injured, right? There's no natural advocate for you other than the attorney you select. And so you're selecting somebody who can provide you legal representation, but you're also selecting that person who's going to advocate for what is in your best interest and what your care needs are. And this idea that you can handle someone's personal injury case and not look at the big picture for them and figure out how can I best resolve this person's problems so that their health insurance, the things that George talked about, wage loss, and their pain and suffering claim. These are multiple different claims. Who can I select that's going to pull that big picture together for me? And who's going to care enough to pull that big picture together and not just try to make a fee off my case? It's the caring and the extra effort to make sure that the person's best interests are fully pursued that I think, and I've learned from my father and other people at the law firm, that that's the most essential part of being a good personal injury attorney, and that's what people really should be looking for.
So George, earlier you mentioned what a person's maybe going through when they leave the hospital, and that's when they start thinking about hiring an attorney. And maybe this is just on TV or in a Grisham novel, but aren't there some attorneys that might actually show up at a hospital and try to get a injured person signed up, or is that something that's not legal in Michigan?
Well, an attorney can come to the hospital if they're invited there by the victim or the victim's family. There isn't anything wrong with that, but it's certainly inappropriate for a lawyer just to show up uninvited and try to solicit a case. That's not appropriate, and you certainly don't, in my opinion, you don't want to be working with somebody that would do that.
And what can happen nowadays is that people will say they represent some organization that might be tied to some law firm or something like that, and they're really trying to say that they want you to go with their organization, and then they end up steering you towards an attorney. So people have to watch out, what people are saying to them and why they're getting the recommendations they're getting.
Well, really the bottom line is if you're still in the hospital, you're not in a position to make a decision, an informed, well thought out decision, either by yourself or with the help of your family, right?
Sometimes that's true, but other times it's not true. And in fact, there are certain kinds of cases where if you do have the support of your family, and if you do have the requisite clarity of mind, you do want to get a lawyer involved right away, because one of the things that we do is we thoroughly investigate the liability facts. And sometimes evidence has a way of kind of vanishing. And so it is important to get an early start in certain cases, but certainly nobody should be retaining a lawyer if they don't understand, or their family doesn't understand, what their legal rights are and what the situation basically is.
Great. Well, this has been extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Steve, and especially George, for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm. Go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics and to view other In the Name of the Law episodes. In the Name of Family Law.
Today we're going to talk about a hot topic in divorce cases, separate property. And we're here today with Patrick Bailey and Amy Bailey of Bailey Terranova. So Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about the separate property issue?
Yeah, so we're having a lot more clients come into our office that are deciding to get married later in life, and what comes with that is that people are bringing more separate property into the marriage, and they're very concerned about, is this now marital property, or is this going to remain my sole property that I worked hard to bring into this?
So what is separate property?
Separate property is anything that you accumulate prior to your marriage. So whether that's your earnings in your bank accounts, or maybe you bought a house or some sort that you're bringing into the marriage, and then you can also achieve separate property while you're married. A lot of people don't really grasp that when you get inheritance or gifts from parents, that can remain separate property. But the issue we also have with our clients in that instance is that people don't know how to keep that separate. They commingle it with other funds, which then makes it marital property.
So do you mean like putting it in a joint bank account? What do you mean by commingling?
So there's a couple of different ways that separate property can become marital property. The first is putting it into a joint account, whether you're putting it into a CD or maybe an investment account and putting both people's names on it. Another way separate property becomes marital property is the longer you're married, the higher chance you have that this is going to be considered commingled. If, for example, you bought a house together and were married for 10 or 15 years, and that's going to appreciate in value, the more likely that is going to be considered marital, just because it would be so hard to pinpoint what was brought in versus what has accumulated over time.
And both parties have cared for the home, they both have worked, they both have paid for the mortgage, they both have paid for the property taxes, so it becomes more of a marital interest rather than a separate interest.
So do you have any examples of what would clearly be marital property? I mean, we're talking about separate property as a question that's going to have to be resolved potentially either between the parties or by the court, right? But what's like clear examples of marital property?
Marital property would be anything that appreciates during the marriage as a result of active actions by both parties. So for example, what Amy just brought up, if both parties are renovating a home or both parties are contributing towards investment accounts. For example, if you each have a pension and you're both earning income and you're both contributing towards that retirement account, it's going to be deemed marital because you were able to forego other investment opportunities because you were relying on this other person that was investing your marital income into that.
And people need to realize that a lot of times we'll have people say, well, I'm the one that earned it. I earned that pension. She didn't do anything or he didn't do anything. That doesn't matter. I mean, the courts are looking at what was accumulated during the marriage. So even though you're the pension holder, your spouse would be entitled to 50% of what was accumulated during the marriage, which is hard for some people to stomach, but that's the law.
So what are the factors that the court would consider to decide whether an asset is separate or marital property?
So there's only a couple of ways that assets can appreciate passively, which would keep it as separate property. The first is overall market inflation. Just the costs of things are going up and you didn't do anything to make it go up.
Like if you had stocks, for example?
Yeah, stocks, anything in your bank accounts, just the value of the dollar, which is going to change over time. And that leads us to market appreciation. So for your stocks, if you had investment accounts, we don't advise this because no one goes into a marriage thinking we want this to be separate property the whole entire time. But if you had an investment account going into the marriage, it would be best to keep that separate so it could grow passively and you wouldn't want to contribute any of your income moving forward into that. We would advise you making a joint account with your significant other. And the third way is just an accumulation of interest, which there's many different accounts, CDs, so forth, that can accumulate over time. And those are really the only three ways something can appreciate passively.
So what's the difference with active appreciation?
Active appreciation, which we would see, is when you bring real estate into a marriage and you decide to grow a business on it. Or, for example, there was one case where there was a guy that had patents and he brought it into the marriage. And because his wife ended up being a stay-at-home wife, he was able to act on those patents and grow them into inventions and make money off of that. That's actively taking separate property and building onto it, and that just becomes marital property over time.
And another big thing that we see is when people live together but they're not married. So one person, the significant other, moves in with the person whose name is on the house, the deed, and then that person contributes to the mortgage payment. That person contributes to renovations. And so what is the growth and the value? But I mean, it's difficult. If you're not married, it's difficult to convince a court that you should have an interest in that property if your name is not on it.
So let's talk about one last concept. The invasion of separate property is a term I've heard. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so this is an example where separate property doesn't become marital property from the commingling or the length of the marriage. This, in fact, remains separate property, but the court, when the parties are separating, decide, okay, this party is being unfairly compensated, so we're going to have to invade this separate property. So the example of doing that is, one, the person contributed towards the growth in that asset. Like Amy brought up, whether they were renovating it or they were cleaning or doing gardening or just something that kept the property value going up. And the other one is the marital estate that they were separating just wasn't enough to satisfy the need of the other party. So the court has the option to invade this separate property to properly compensate the other individual.
And is that because the trial court's job is to do equity in a divorce case?
That's exactly right. It's a court of equity, and they have the unilateral power to invade these assets, even though law would say otherwise.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for helping us understand this complex area of separate property versus marital property, and we're really happy that you came on today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
In the Name of Family Law is brought to you by Bailey and Terranova Attorneys at Law.
Welcome back. Today's episode we were talking about reality and how that impacts different areas of practice, like selecting a personal injury attorney, or dividing or invading separate property in a divorce action, or dealing with incentivized witnesses in criminal cases. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
Well, thank you, Lisa, for using more of the terminology that I like and not what Takura likes, which is just snitches. But I think that the reality of using witnesses who are being compensated, more often than not with money, but compensated with getting time, 10 years, 20 years off their sentence, is a shock for most people. They think, how can that really be happening? Isn't that akin to bribery? And it's allowed under our criminal justice system.
Yeah, and talk about realities. We have so many advertisements for personal injury, and it's really hard for people to understand what the reality is all about. And so I hope the segment today helped people see all the different things that go into what should be a good decision in terms of who to hire, what it's really all about. And it's not what you see on the TV screen with your advertisements. It's not what you see in the media in terms of the negative stereotypes. There's a lot more to know if you've been injured and you need a lawyer.
Part of it's doing your research, right?
That's right.
It's not just, and for you, it's the clients doing their research before they decide who they're going to go with. And for Mary, it's the firm, the attorneys, and the team doing research about these incentivized witnesses to find out how to really show their lack of credibility.
Right. We're lucky we work with a lot of great investigators who are, on our team, and they really, they dig deep. They go interview other people who may know information about the witness. They are really boots on the ground, knocking on doors, and a lot of times we have to be as well.
Amy?
Well, as we learned in our segment today, it's very important if a person receives, for an example, an inheritance and they do not want their spouse to receive any portion of that, they need to keep it in a separate account. They can't add their spouse's name to it. If they buy a boat from that account and they put their spouse's name on the boat, then that will be considered marital property. And you have to plan ahead, and you have to make sure that you speak with an attorney who's well educated in that area so that you understand exactly what will happen to that property.
Right. And I think really the lesson to be learned is when people come to a family law attorney, they're getting divorced, just because they receive something by gift or inheritance, everybody thinks, oh, well, that's separate, that's mine, I don't have to share that. Well, that's not exactly true. There's a lot of rules that go into it, a lot of statutes, and it's not as clear-cut. A lot of things aren't clear-cut, even though clients like to think, oh, that's going to be really easy to figure out. Not quite so easy.
There are almost no easy things in the law. It's amazing. Law and Order has done us a disservice by making it seem so easy. Right?
In 1 hour, you
right,
can
I
figure this all out.
know. At least for our clients, they think that. That is not true.
I think that's true with family law clients as well.
There's the law and the reality of the law,
Right.
which
Exactly.
is the whole other dimension that people need to understand a little bit more.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for today's episode. It was really interesting, and I can't wait to see you again.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Lisa.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.